CFI Pro courses, and what a wonderful way to kind of start off the new year. I hope everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving and a very Merry Christmas. And this time we're going to keep on going forward with what we did last time that we met, which is talk about our endorsements and how we would answer questions on endorsements. Now, I am going to be publishing a few of these today. I know that I usually sparse these out or place them a pretty good bit out from one another, but I'm actually going to go ahead and actually give you all the endorsement scenarios tonight. And then if there are any other scenarios that you're interested about, I would like for you to please post a comment and I'll record those scenarios at the very first part of the new year. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about our next endorsement that we would talk about in a check ride. So in the check ride, last time we talked about doing an endorsement for an initial private pilot, and I am talking specifically to you only with single engine. So single engine airplane is the only thing that I'm talking with you about. I'm not talking to rotor pilots or glider pilots. I am going to have some things start to come up at the first of the year in regards to those different type ones, but those are going to be really rare simply because we just don't have as many of those as we do airplane pilots. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. But first, please make a do me a big favor. If you have seen this on YouTube, if you would, please make sure that you subscribe to my channel and give me a like and click on that little bell for future notifications. And if you're a current Patreon member and you're seeing this, please make sure to tell a friend or 20 about my channel, and I would love to be able to work with as many CFIs as I possibly can. All right, I've spent about 2.5 minutes now talking about that, so let's move on to the first thing. So the next scenario that you may hear on a check ride is an additional pilot certificate. So our first video that we had on endorsements was about the initial pilot qualification. So initial private, initial recreational, something like that. But now we're going to talk about an additional pilot. So someone is already a pilot and they want to achieve a different level of pilot certification. For instance, this would go from recreational to private, from private to commercial, and so on and so on. So we're trying to get an additional grade of pilot certificate. So how would the examiner say this on the check ride? The examiner would probably say something like this. You have a private pilot who is instrument rated and they come into your flight school and they're inquiring about getting a commercial pilot certificate. They may have their own plane. They may want to rent an airplane from the flight school. But the bottom line is they want to be able to complete their commercial certification. Normally at this time, the examiner is going to give you a set of numbers, a set of qualifications. They may say something to you like, the person has this much total time. They have this much instrument time. They have this much night time. They have this cross country. So they may actually give you a certain set of parameters. This is where your knowledge of the regulations is really going to come into play, because you have to pre-qualify the person to ensure that you know what you have to do as the instructor in order to qualify the person for the check ride and in order to conduct the training. So let's just look at this as a person coming in who has roughly 500 hours. They have plenty of night. They have plenty of IFR time. They basically meet all the requirements. They just need to be endorsed for the check ride. So I think that's the more basic core one. So let's talk about that. So to do this, before you start the conversation, there really doesn't need a lesson plan to be brought out at this particular time. But if you have one, that's okay. You can do that. but you definitely need to have your advisory circular 6165, the most current version, whichever it is when you watch this video, because as you know, the FAA likes to change things all the time. So whatever the most current version of the advisory circular 6165. And then I would also have my regulations turned to the commercial regs. So from 61.121 to 61.131, and you want to make sure 133, somewhere around that area. But just want to make sure that you have those open to be able to understand the eligibility. This is not an additional category or an additional class, so you don't need to look at FAR 6163. That would not be something that you need to look at this particular juncture, because we're not doing an additional category or an additional class. So the next thing to look at is look at the time and figure out what you need to do. So you would go to 61.129 and you would look at the total time requirement, and you would go through the pilot's logbook and do an audit. And as you're looking at the audit, you can go ahead and make yourself a list about what you have to do. And so you would say, okay, do you have 100 hours in airplanes? Do you have 50 hours of PIC? Do you have the cross country? Do you have the night? Do you have the instrument training that is per 61.129? That is a very good catch there. Examiners will look at something and say, well, just because someone has an instrument rating, do they meet the instrument requirements of 61.129? The answer is yes and no. It depends on how it's logged. So if it's not logged as 61 training per 61.129 dot, and then whatever the one is for instrument, then no, that would not apply for that. So you want to make sure that it's logged correctly. Now you could overlap some things from instrument into the commercial as long as it's logged correctly in the endorsements. Anyway, you would continue to go down through the night and make sure that every one of the items that's been remarked says training per 61.129 and then the respective letter. If you don't see that it's not been logged that way, then you can't count that time for the commercial, and you can't make a change to that. Only the instructor who made that particular remarks in that endorsement section is going to be able to be qualified to do that. So once you complete the audit, then you're going to have a plan of action about what you're going to do, and you can work with your client to ensure that they say, okay, you know, look, you're missing this nighttime cross country, you're missing a couple of hours of instrument per 61.129, you're missing your long cross country, and then you can go ahead and start putting that plan of action together. Now, the good thing about the commercial is that it's a very easily endorsed thing, because there's literally only 3 endorsements at a bare bones minimum, and it actually could be more. So if you're looking in your advisory circular, if you want to turn to your Alpha 1 endorsement, that's always, if a check ride has an airplane involved in it, it's always going to be an Alpha 1 endorsement. That states that you meet all the requirements per 61.39, Alpha 6, I, and double I, saying that you've had the training and you're ready for the test, and it's been done within the preceding 2 calendar months preceding the month of the test. So that's the first one. If they would have been able to take the written test, the knowledge test, and of course that's your Alpha 32. And that's what you give your student to be able to go to the testing center to take the test. Now, depending on whether or not your student scores a 100 or not would be the determination on whether you give them an Alpha 2 endorsement. So your Alpha 2 endorsement is stating that's, of course, you know, that's my nickname for that. It's the biggest lie in aviation. That's your 61.39 A6 III. And that is the one that states that you've reviewed all the deficient areas on the knowledge test. And of course, you probably have listened to this before, and you know that I call that the biggest lie in aviation, because instructors don't like to do that review. The last endorsement that you would give them would be the Alpha 33, and that states that they're actually meeting all the requirements for 61-127 and all the time requirements for 61-129. One of the things that you don't want to forget to do is make sure that you log all of the ground time per 61-125 and 61-127. So there is some ground items in 61-127. It's not just flight items. Like for instance, if you're going to have a ground school over pre-flight preparation or something like that, you want to make sure that all that stuff is logged accordingly. So please make sure that you keep your logs as accurate as possible, because there has been documented times, even lately within the last 2 weeks, I know of an examiner who turned down not doing a commercial check ride because the person didn't have the ground school that's actually listed in the first couple of letters of the 61-127 regulatory guidance for being a commercial pilot. So ideally, there's only 4 endorsements that you would need for this, and that's your Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Alpha 32, Alpha 33 and Alpha 34. I do apologize. The 32, 33 is private, 34, 35 is commercial. I apologize. I think during the editing I'll go back and make sure that I put something at the bottom there at the page that says that I was wrong. It should be Alpha 34, 35. So private is 1, 2, 32, 33, and commercial is 1, 2, 34, 35. Now, there are some caveats onto that, and that is if the person is going to be taking their check ride in like a high performance or a complex or maybe a tail dragger, then you have to go to 61.33 and make sure that you give them, or 61.31, and you give them the appropriate endorsement for whatever they're going to be flying to act as PIC. Like if you're going to give them a complex endorsement because they're flying a complex aircraft, or a tail dragger, or a high performance, whatever the fact is. So it could be a minimum of 3 endorsements if they made a 100, but it could be many, it could be 6 or 7 endorsements if they didn't make a 100 and they're flying a tail dragger complex high performance aircraft. Or even a high altitude aircraft that's capable of high altitude. So sky's the limits on that. So this is how we would endorse someone in regards to an additional pilot certificate, and that's coming from private over to commercial. Some of the questions that the examiner may ask you during this time is, what do you actually have to log? So they'll ask you some of these very basic core questions, like what are you supposed to log? What are you required to log? Well, according to 61.189, anytime you give any training whatsoever, you have to log that, especially if it's for a certificate or a rating. So that's in accordance with 61.189. And so you would want to go ahead and give them that. They'll say, what if the student failed? Can you go ahead and what would you have to do to retrain them? Well, you would retrain them on the entire area of operation, not just in the task. So if a person failed their check ride or received a notice of disapproval, on short field takeoff and landing, then you would not just go out and retrain them just on short field takeoff and landing. You would have to retrain them on the entire area of operation for takeoff and landings, and then they would go back and be retested on the entire area of operation. It is not the correct way to do it when the examiner only retests on the deficient task, because the failure of one task means you failed the entire area of operation, and the examiner is supposed to go back and retest over the entire area of operation, not necessarily just the one task that was failed. With that, that's going to be your 6149 endorsement. And you do not have to be the person's instructor to give the 6149 endorsement, and there is no minimum flight time requirement to satisfy that. Actually, some of that training or all of that training could actually be done in a simulator. So you want to make sure that you check on that as well, especially like if somebody failed an instrument test or something like that, or instrument practical, they could actually go back and fly an approach in a sim. They wouldn't have to go back in the airplane as well. Some of the other questions would be, does a complex endorsement ever expire? And that is, no, it never expires. How long is an IACRA application good for? 60 days. How long is the endorsement valid for that you're going to give for them in their logbook for the check ride? 60 days. So everything's 60 days as far as expiration, and that's the reason why you want to sign your IACRA and the logbook for the check ride on the same day. So this is how to go from one pilot certificate to another pilot certificate. In this scenario, it's from private to commercial. I hope that you learned a lot. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, and click on the little notification bell. Thank you so much to my new Patreons for the month of December. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you in just a second for some more how-to endorsements. I'm Todd with CFI Pro Courses. Bye-bye.